The story of the Ottoman Empire begins not with a great empire, but with a small frontier principality on the edge of a collapsing world. At the dawn of the 14th century, the once mighty Byzantine Empire was shrinking, its power eroded by centuries of war, internal strife, and foreign invasions. In Anatolia, countless Turkish beyliks, small warlike states, carved up the land once held by the Romans of the East. Among them was a tiny state ruled by a man named Osman. Osman I, the son of Ertugrul, was not a king of great armies or vast wealth, yet he possessed something even more powerful: vision and the ability to rally men around his banner. In 1299, Osman declared his independence, establishing the dynasty that would bear his name, the Ottomans. What began as a modest warrior principality on the Byzantine frontier would, within centuries, become one of the greatest empires the world had ever seen. The Ottomans' earliest advantage lay in geography. Positioned on the Byzantine borderlands, they were constantly engaged in raids, battles, and small wars. This sharpened their military skills and gave them a steady supply of territory and loot. But it also gave them something else: legitimacy. For Muslim warriors of the frontier, known as Ghazis, fighting against the Christian Byzantines was considered a holy duty. Osman embraced this identity, presenting his principality not merely as a state, but as a religiously sanctioned cause. The Ghazis flocked to his banner, and his domain expanded. When Osman died around 1324, his son Orhan took command. Orhan was more than just a warrior. He was a builder. He organized the fledgling state, introduced coinage, and captured key Byzantine cities, including Bursa in 1326, which became the first true Ottoman capital. From Bursa, the Ottomans gained access to trade routes, wealth, and legitimacy as rulers of a proper city. But Orhan's greatest innovation was not military conquest, it was the creation of a standing army. While other beyliks relied on tribal levies and temporary fighters, the Ottomans developed a new institution: the Janissaries. Formed in the mid-13th century, this elite corps was recruited from young Christian boys taken through the Devshirme system. Converted to Islam, trained rigorously, and loyal only to the Sultan, the Janissaries became the backbone of Ottoman power for centuries. They were a revolutionary force in medieval warfare, professional, disciplined, and utterly devoted. By the mid-13th century, the Ottomans had crossed into Europe. Taking advantage of Byzantine civil wars and internal chaos, they established a foothold in Thrace. The capture of Gallipoli in 1354 opened the gateway to the Balkans. Within decades, Ottoman armies surged into southeastern Europe, clashing with Serbian princes, Bulgarian czars, and Hungarian kings. The Battle of Kosovo in 1389 became legendary. Sultan Murad I fell in battle, but his son Bayezid I, known as the Thunderbolt, carried on the fight, pushing the Ottomans deeper into the Balkans. But destiny is never without peril. In 1402, at the Battle of Ankara, Bayezid faced an enemy greater than any European king: the conqueror, Timur, also known as Tamerlane. The Ottomans were crushed. Bayezid himself was captured, and the once rising empire seemed on the brink of collapse. For a decade, civil war raged between Bayezid's sons in what came to be known as the Ottoman Interregnum. Rivals and enemies circled, hoping to carve up Ottoman lands, but the dynasty endured. Mehmet I emerged victorious, reuniting the fractured state. His son Murad II rebuilt Ottoman power and renewed expansion. In 1444, at the Battle of Varna, Murad's armies crushed a crusader force led by European kings, securing Ottoman dominance in the Balkans once more. The empire had not only survived its brush with destruction, it had grown stronger, more resilient, more determined. And then came the moment that would define not just the Ottomans, but the course of world history. In 1451, Mehmet II ascended the throne. Young, ambitious, and brilliant, Mehmet possessed a singular vision: to capture Constantinople, the jewel of Byzantium, the city that had stood for over 1,000 years as the bastion of Christian Europe in the East. Previous sultans had tried and failed. Constantinople's massive Theodosian walls were legendary, repelling armies for centuries. But Mehmet was determined. He gathered engineers, built an immense fleet, and most importantly, cast enormous cannons, massive bombards capable of hurling stone balls that could shatter even the strongest walls. In April 1553, the siege began. Ottoman armies surrounded the city by land and sea, cutting it off completely. For weeks, thunderous bombardments shook the ancient walls. Inside, the last Byzantine emperor, Constantine XI, rallied his men in a desperate defense. Priests prayed in Hagia Sophia, soldiers manned the walls, and the people of the city clung to hope. But on May 29th, after weeks of relentless assault, the Ottomans launched their final attack. Waves of soldiers crashed against the battered walls. The Janissaries surged forward, disciplined and unyielding. At dawn, the defense finally broke. The Ottomans poured into the city, and Constantine XI fell fighting, sword in hand, becoming a martyr for his doomed empire. Mehmet rode into the gates of Constantinople in triumph. He entered Hagia Sophia, the greatest church of Christendom, and ordered it converted into a mosque. From that moment, the city was reborn as Istanbul, the new capital of the Ottoman Empire. The world would never be the same. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 was more than a victory. It was a transformation. For the Ottomans, it marked the end of a century of struggle and the beginning of a new destiny. For the world, it was the end of the Middle Ages and the dawn of the modern era. Sultan Mehmed II, now remembered as Mehmed the Conqueror, was only 21 years old when he achieved the impossible. Yet his conquest was not the culmination of his ambitions, it was only the beginning. In the years that followed, he set about reshaping the city he had taken, turning it into the beating heart of a vast empire. He renamed it Istanbul, though to many Europeans it would remain Constantinople. He repaired aqueducts, rebuilt markets, and welcomed traders and artisans from across the world. The Hagia Sophia, once the greatest church of Christendom, was now a mosque, but Mehmed allowed Christians and Jews to continue practicing their faiths. This policy of relative tolerance became a cornerstone of Ottoman rule, ensuring stability across a realm that encompassed many peoples and religions. But Mehmed's vision extended far beyond city walls. He expanded deep into the Balkans, conquering Serbia, Bosnia, and much of Albania. In the east, he pressed against the Anatolian Beyliks and defeated the Karamanids, bringing the peninsula under tighter Ottoman control. His armies even pushed into Italy, seizing Otranto in 1480. For a brief moment, it seemed that Rome itself might fall to the Ottomans. Mehmed died the following year, but his empire was secure. His successors would continue his legacy. Under Bayezid II and Selim I, the Ottomans grew into a superpower. Bayezid was a cautious ruler, focusing on consolidation, trade, and diplomacy. But Selim, known as Selim the Grim, was ruthless, ambitious, and utterly determined. Selim's reign was short but transformative. In a series of lightning campaigns, he crushed the Safavids of Persia at the Battle of Chaldiran in 1414, securing eastern Anatolia. Then he turned south. Within just a few years, his armies swept through Syria, Palestine, and Egypt, defeating the Mamluk Sultanate. In 1517, Cairo fell. The Ottomans now controlled the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, as well as the seat of the Abbasid Caliphate. Selim assumed the title of Caliph, positioning the Ottoman sultans not only as rulers of an empire, but as leaders of the Islamic world. The stage was now set for the greatest of all Ottoman rulers, Suleiman I, remembered in the West as Suleiman the Magnificent, and in the East as Kanuni, the lawgiver. Ascending the throne in 1520, Suleiman inherited an empire at the height of its power. Yet he was determined to expand it further and to leave his indelible mark on history. His reign would last nearly half a century, and during that time, the Ottoman Empire would reach its zenith. In Europe, Suleiman's armies marched relentlessly. In 1521, Belgrade fell. In 1526, at the Battle of Mohacs, the Ottomans annihilated the Hungarian army, killing King Louis II and shattering the medieval kingdom of Hungary. Much of Central Europe now lay open. 2 years later, Suleiman laid siege to Vienna. Though the city held out, the message was clear. The Ottomans were a force to be reckoned with at the very heart of Europe. The fear of the Turk at the gates would haunt European consciousness for centuries. But Suleiman's ambitions were not confined to Europe. In the east, he fought the Safavids, securing Baghdad and pushing Ottoman influence deep into Mesopotamia. In the Mediterranean, his fleets clashed with the Spanish and the Venetians. The famed Admiral Barbarossa became the terror of Christendom, dominating the sea from Algiers to the Aegean. The Ottoman navy, in alliance with France, even sailed into the western Mediterranean, threatening the coasts of Italy and Spain. In 1535, Suleiman forged an unprecedented alliance with King Francis I of France. A Christian king and a Muslim sultan united against their common enemy, the Habsburgs. It was a shocking development for Europe and a sign of the Ottomans' diplomatic clout. Yet Suleiman was not only a conqueror, he was also a legislator. He reformed the empire's legal system, harmonizing Islamic law with imperial decrees. His code of laws earned him the title Kanuni, the lawgiver. Under his reign, the Ottoman state became not only a military machine, but also a sophisticated bureaucracy. Istanbul flourished as a cultural and commercial hub. The city's skyline was transformed by the architect Mimar Sinan, whose mosques and palaces rivaled the grandeur of ancient Rome. Poets, scholars, and artists thrived under his patronage. The empire was a mosaic of peoples: Turks, Greeks, Armenians, Arabs, Jews, Slavs, united under the authority of the Sultan. Yet even at the height of power, shadows lingered. Court intrigues and succession struggles simmered beneath the surface. Suleiman's powerful wife Hurrem Sultan, known in the West as Roxelana, played a pivotal role in palace politics, challenging traditional structures. The infamous execution of Suleiman's son Mustafa at the Sultan's own order revealed the deadly stakes of dynastic rivalry. Still, Suleiman endured. By the time of his death in 1566, on campaign in Hungary, the Ottoman Empire stretched from the gates of Vienna to the Persian Gulf, from the deserts of Arabia to the shores of North Africa. It was a realm of immense power, wealth, and cultural brilliance. Historians would later call this the Ottoman Golden Age, and rightly so, for in those years the empire was not merely a regional power, it was a global one. But as history would soon prove, no golden age lasts forever. The death of Suleiman the Magnificent in 1566 marked not only the end of a reign, but the end of an era. For nearly half a century, the Sultan known as Kanuni, the lawgiver, had carried the Ottoman Empire to its zenith. His armies had shaken Europe, his fleets had commanded the seas, his laws had given order to a vast and diverse realm. When he died on campaign in Hungary, the empire seemed invincible. Yet in the silence that followed his passing, the seeds of decline had already been sown. Behind the gilded gates of Topkapi Palace, shadows gathered. The transfer of power, once a triumph of continuity, had become a deadly gamble. The Ottoman dynasty's greatest strength, its unbroken line of sultans, was also its greatest curse. For every new ruler, there were brothers, uncles, and nephews with equal claim to the throne, and in the empire of shadows, mercy was weakness. It was Mehmed the Conqueror, centuries earlier, who had codified the practice of fratricide. The empire could not survive civil war, he reasoned, and so the only way to guarantee stability was to extinguish every rival. When a sultan ascended the throne, his brothers were strangled, one by one, with silken bowstrings. No blood was to be shed, for the law forbade spilling royal blood, but breath was taken all the same. By the late 16th century, this grim ritual had become a cornerstone of succession. Princes, once raised together in splendor, grew up knowing that only one would live. Their mothers whispered in the shadows, maneuvering to secure the throne for their sons, and when the inevitable came, the cries of the condemned were muffled by silk, their bodies carried quietly through hidden passages of the palace. It was a policy meant to ensure unity, but it bred only fear. With Suleiman's death, the empire entered a new phase, one that Europeans would later call the Sultanate of Women. Harem Sultan, Suleiman's beloved consort and later his wife, had broken centuries of tradition by becoming the first woman to marry a sultan. She wielded immense influence during his reign, shaping policy, alliances, and even the line of succession. Her triumph opened the way for others. The 17th century had closed in blood and fear. Janissaries strangled sultans, viziers rose and fell in endless cycles of ambition, and the whispers of the harem echoed through the marble corridors of Topkapi. Yet the empire endured. To the outside world, the Ottomans still commanded a realm vast enough to terrify Europe, but within, the cracks widened. The 18th century would not bring renewal. It would bring decline, slow, grinding, and filled with shadows. The great wars with Europe revealed how far the empire had fallen from the days of Suleiman. The long conflict with Austria and the Holy League ended with the Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699, a moment that stunned the Ottoman world. For the first time in centuries, the empire ceded large territories to its European enemies. Hungary and Transylvania were lost, and with them the dream of expansion into the heart of Europe. To the Ottomans, the defeat was more than a military setback. It was the shattering of an illusion, the recognition that the empire was no longer invincible. As the 18th century dawned, the Ottoman court sought to mask weakness with ceremony. Sultans emerged less as conquerors and more as symbols, their presence confined to the rituals of the palace. Real power shifted to viziers, generals, and factions within the harem. Topkapi became less a command center of empire and more a labyrinth of intrigue, where survival depended on whispered alliances and secret betrayals. In the provinces, governors enriched themselves at the expense of the state. Taxes were squeezed mercilessly from peasants who saw little in return. Corruption bled through the administration like a disease. Local notables, once loyal servants of the Sultan, became semi-independent lords, ruling their lands as their own fiefdoms. The empire was fracturing piece by piece, even as it struggled to present the image of unity. Wars continued, but victories became rare. Against Russia, the Ottomans found themselves repeatedly humbled. The great northern power, armed with new technologies and reformed armies, pushed south, threatening the Black Sea and the Caucasus. Each defeat carved away more of the empire's pride. Each treaty signed under duress weakened its standing in Europe. The once dreaded crescent banner was now often seen retreating before the double-headed eagle of the Tsars. Yet decline was not only a matter of lost wars. Within Istanbul, the Janissaries, once the disciplined core of the Ottoman military, had become a parasitic force. They resisted reform, clung to privilege, and sold their loyalty to the highest bidder. They extorted merchants, terrorized citizens, and interfered with succession. The sultans who feared their wrath dared not move against them. The empire's defenders had become its tormentors. The harem, too, continued to weave its deadly web. Powerful mothers and consorts influenced the selection of viziers, manipulated succession, and enriched themselves through bribes and gifts. Each new sultan ascended the throne already entangled in schemes not of his making. Brothers continued to die in silken silence, their lives extinguished to preserve the illusion of stability. The marble floors of Topkapi, polished and gleaming, hid beneath them the bones of countless princes, viziers, and servants sacrificed to the empire's survival. Even in times of peace, the empire was restless. Rebellions flared in the Balkans, uprisings shook Anatolia, and desert tribes in Arabia defied Ottoman authority. The empire stretched wide, but its grip was loosening. What had once been bound together by the force of conquest was now unraveling under the weight of neglect and corruption. And yet, for all its weakness, the Ottoman Empire retained a strange kind of resilience. Trade continued to flow through its cities. Istanbul remained one of the largest and most cosmopolitan capitals in the world, its bazaars bustling, its mosques rising above the skyline. European ambassadors still treated the Sultan with respect, though now more out of tradition than fear. The empire was not dead, it was decaying, slowly, visibly, but still alive. For the people who lived within its borders, the 18th century was an age of uncertainty. Farmers struggled against heavy taxes and constant demands from local lords. Soldiers faced campaigns without pay or purpose. Merchants found opportunity in trade, but risked ruin from Janissary extortion or arbitrary confiscation. In the villages and towns, life went on, but under the shadow of decline. At court, efforts at reform flickered and died. Some sultans, like Ahmed III, experimented with renewal. The so-called tulip era brought moments of cultural flowering, with new architecture, gardens, and even the first printing presses. But beneath the beauty was fragility. The extravagance of the court enraged the Janissaries and the common people, leading to the violent Patrana Halil rebellion of 1730. The flowers of the tulip era were trampled under the boots of mobs demanding blood. Each attempt to modernize faced resistance. The Janissaries blocked military reform. The ulema, the religious scholars, resisted legal changes. Local elites resisted central authority. Every effort to strengthen the empire only revealed how weak it had become. The sultans themselves, often raised in isolation within the palace, lacked the vision or the strength to break free of the chains that bound them. They were emperors in name, but prisoners of their own court. Europe, meanwhile, surged ahead. The scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, and the rise of powerful centralized states transformed the balance of the world. The Ottomans, once at the forefront of innovation and conquest, fell further behind. Their armies carried muskets when Europe deployed bayonets and artillery. Their fleets rotted in harbors, while European navies mastered the oceans. Their bureaucracy stagnated as Europe experimented with new forms of government and finance. The empire that had once dictated the fate of kings was now struggling simply to survive. By the close of the 18th century, the phrase, "the sick man of Europe," had not yet been coined, but the reality it described was already clear. The Ottoman Empire remained vast, its sultans still clad in splendor, its mosques still filled with worshippers. But its power was hollow, its authority undermined, its future uncertain. The shadows that had gathered after Suleiman's death now covered the empire entirely, leaving only the faint memory of former glory. The long decline was not a sudden fall, but a slow erosion, a bleeding that never stopped. And though the empire would endure into the next century, it would do so as a ghost of its former self, an empire of ceremony and memory, but not of power. The Ottomans once terrified the world. Now they terrified only themselves. The 18th century had left the Ottoman Empire bruised, but still alive. By the dawn of the 19th century, its territory stretched from the Balkans to Arabia, from North Africa to the Caucasus. Yet beneath the surface, the empire was rotting. The world was changing. Europe surged forward with revolutions, machines, and new armies, while the Ottomans clung to traditions that had long since turned to chains. What had once been the terror of Christendom was now whispered about in European courts with pity and contempt, the sick man of Europe. The 19th century was a time of rebellion. In the Balkans, Christian subjects rose against their Ottoman rulers, inspired by nationalism and encouraged by European powers. Greece fought for independence in the 1820s, and though the Ottomans resisted fiercely, intervention by Britain, France, and Russia sealed their fate. The land of ancient Hellas was reborn, carved out of Ottoman territory. Serbia, Romania, and Bulgaria followed in waves of blood and fire. One by one, the empire's European provinces broke away, their departure marked by massacres, atrocities, and vengeance. Inside the palace, sultans dreamed of reform. They called it tanzimat, reorganization. New laws promised equality for all citizens. New armies drilled with modern weapons. New schools sought to close the gap with Europe. For a time, hope flickered. The empire could be reborn, modernized, saved. But shadows always returned. Corruption devoured reforms before they could take root. The Janissaries resisted change until they were finally destroyed in 1826, massacred by the very empire they once protected. Their screams echoed through Istanbul as cannon fire shattered their barracks, ending centuries of power in a single bloody day. Even as old institutions fell, new humiliations came. In 1853, the Crimean War erupted. The Ottomans fought alongside Britain and France against Russia, and though they emerged nominally victorious, it was clear to all that the empire survived only because Europe allowed it. The Sultan was no longer a master of destiny, but a pawn in the games of great powers. The empire's weakness invited vultures. Britain sought to control Egypt and the Suez Canal. Russia pushed south, dreaming of Constantinople. Austria and later Germany carved out influence. The Ottoman map was no longer drawn in Topkapi, but in London, St. Petersburg, Paris, and Berlin. Each decade, the empire shrank further. Tunisia, Algeria, Libya, Bosnia, all slipped away. And yet, in the midst of decline, violence never ceased. The Armenian people, long a part of the empire's fabric, became scapegoats in the final decades. Pogroms in the 1890s claimed tens of thousands of lives. The world looked on in horror, but did nothing. In the shadows of the Bosporus, ghosts multiplied. Sultans rose and fell, but none could stop the tide. Abdul Hamid II, known as the Red Sultan, ruled with an iron fist, drowning opposition in blood, while weaving a web of spies and informants. He dreamed of pan-Islamic unity, calling Muslims across the world to rally under his banner. Yet his paranoia isolated him, and his cruelty made him hated even within his own capital. His fall in 1909 came not at the hands of foreign invaders, but by his own army and ministers, tired of living in the shadow of his fear. The Young Turks rose with promises of freedom and reform, but their rule only dragged the empire further into disaster. The First World War sealed its fate. Aligning with Germany, the Ottomans marched once more to war. In Gallipoli, they achieved a desperate victory, hurling back the Allied invasion with rivers of blood. But elsewhere their armies crumbled. In the deserts of Arabia, Lawrence and his rebels tore the empire apart. In Mesopotamia, British troops advanced deep. In the Caucasus, Russian armies struck deep. And as the war raged, the empire's darkest shadow fell upon its own people. The Armenian genocide of 1915, when deportations and massacres turned the roads of Anatolia into graveyards. By 1918, it was over. The armistice of Mudros ended Ottoman participation in the war. Allied warships anchored in the Bosporus, their guns pointed at the heart of Istanbul. The once great empire lay prostrate, its lands occupied, its armies shattered, its treasury empty. The Treaty of Sèvres in 1920 carved up the remains, leaving little more than a shadow of what had once been. And yet in death, the Ottomans gave birth to something new. In Anatolia, Mustafa Kemal rallied the remnants, forging a republic from the ruins. In 1922, the Sultanate was abolished. Mehmed VI, the last Ottoman Sultan, fled Istanbul aboard a British warship, a broken monarch leaving behind 6 centuries of rule. The empire was gone. Its palaces remained. Its mosques still towered over the skyline. Its culture still lived in language, art, and memory. But the dynasty that had once ruled half the known world was no more. The sick man of Europe was dead. And so ended the story of the Ottomans, a story written in conquest and collapse, in glory and blood, in shadows that stretched across centuries. From Osman's small beylik to Suleiman's golden throne, from the whispers of the harem to the cries of Gallipoli, the empire's life was long, its death slow, its memory eternal. But history is never silent. The ghosts of sultans and viziers, of mothers and murdered princes, of armies lost and cities conquered, still linger. They whisper from the stones of Istanbul, from the ruins of forgotten palaces, from the forests where Vlad left his terrible mark. If you wish to walk deeper into their shadows, to uncover more forbidden chapters of our past, then step with us. Leave a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for the next journey. The empire may be gone, but its darkness still remains.